According to research carried out by Hannah Ritchie for the Our World in Data website, almost half of all habitable land on Earth is currently used for agriculture, and the industry as a whole is responsible for more than a quarter of all global greenhouse gas emissions. So I thought it was about time to take a proper look at the subject, and it turns out it's bloody complicated. Hello, and welcome to Just Ever Think. Way back in 2019, I made a video based on one of the chapters in this incredibly informative book. The book's author, Berners-Lee, tells us that according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, human beings on average need to consume 2,350 kilocalories worth of food per day. You and I generally refer to kilocalories simply as calories, so for the rest of this video, I'll use that shorthand. Globally, we grow 5,940 calories worth of crops per person per day. 340 of those calories stay in the ground for various reasons like inefficiency and unnecessarily fussy quality standards. Another 330 are lost as a result of poor storage. About 130 calories get replanted for the following year. 810 calories are converted into biofuels, and no fewer than 1,740 calories are fed to animals. That leaves 2,520 purely plant-based calories per person per day available for human consumption. Meat and dairy products yield a further 590 calories per person per day on average. We lose 320 of those calories in processing and distribution, leaving a combined plant and animal total of 2,790 calories per person per day on average available for human consumption. Roughly 260 of those calories get tossed into household waste each day, so that leaves an average of 2,530 calories, which is 180 more than we need. Of course, global distribution of those calories is staggeringly unfair and inequitable, but we'll come back to that a bit later. Let's focus on those animal calories first of all, though. We've just seen that on average we feed livestock animals 1,740 calories per person per day of crops that we humans could very happily eat ourselves. That livestock gets another 3,810 calories per person per day from stuff like grass that we humans can't eat. That means the average farm animal converts only 10% of all the calories it consumes into meat and dairy products that we can consume. To put it another way, the quantity of human edible crops that we feed to animals would be enough to provide for 75% of all the calories required by the human species, and yet the number of calories we actually get back from those animals makes up just 23% of our calorific needs on average. It's not just about basic calories though, is it? We need to get the right amount of nutrients from our food as well, don't we? Take protein, for example. According to Berners-Lee, the average human requires about 50 grams of protein per day. His data reveal that we currently produce 184 protein grams per person per day from all the crops we grow globally. We lose about 10 grams through harvesting inefficiencies and a bit more in storage. That leaves 167 grams of plant-based protein. Only 61 grams of that are used to directly feed human beings though. 89 grams are fed to livestock. Grass and pasture adds a bit more protein, so of the 140 protein grams per person per day that we feed to animals, we get just 38 grams back out as meat and dairy products. There are some other losses in processing and distribution, leaving a grand total of 88 grams of plant and animal protein per person per day available for human consumption. On average, we humans throw about 7 of those protein grams away and consume 81 grams, which is 2/3 more than the 50 grams we need. Again, on average, show those numbers to a subsistence farmer in sub-Saharan Africa, and I suspect she'd laugh in your face. But again, we'll come back to that a bit later on. The point is, at least according to this data, raising livestock is a highly resource-intensive and incredibly inefficient way of providing calories and protein for human beings. And it turns out we humans can get pretty much all the other nutrients we need from plants too. Take the dreaded soya bean, for example. This book explains that gram for gram, a soya bean has more of almost every essential human nutrient than beef and lamb. But 95% of the soybeans farmed on deforested Brazilian Amazon land are shipped to Europe and Asia to feed cattle, pigs and poultry, 80% of which goes to China. Only about 6% of all global soybean production is processed into food for human consumption. Mike Berners-Lee also reminds us of the growing problem of antibiotic overuse in livestock production. At the time of writing his book, an estimated 2/3 of the more than 63,000 tonnes of antibiotics consumed globally each year were going into animals to stimulate growth and prevent disease. Some of those antibiotics make their way back into the human food chain via meat and milk. The race between increasing antibiotic resistance and the development of next-generation alternatives appears to be going in the wrong direction, according to Berners-Lee, and the potential collapse of antibiotics as a useful therapy is perilously close. And then there's the old chestnut of methane emissions from cow burps. There have been recent efforts by the meat industry to convince us that methane from cows is a natural part of the carbon cycle and that it all gets harmlessly converted by things called hydroxyls in the atmosphere into carbon dioxide and water, which then get reabsorbed back into the land as new crops grow, just like nature intended. The trouble is, there's absolutely nothing natural about 1.5 billion farmed cattle existing worldwide, with a significant proportion being fattened up on intensive feedlots, otherwise known as concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, in countries like USA, Brazil and Argentina. The US Department of Agriculture defines CAFOs as operations where animals are kept and raised in confined situations for 45 days or more, where livestock, animal feed, manure and urine, dead animals and production operations are maintained on a small land area, where no grazing is allowed and where manure slurry is discharged into adjacent lagoons or pumped into irrigation equipment that sprays the waste onto open fields. There are currently about 25,000 CAFOs in the United States alone, accounting for 90% of all the meat and eggs consumed in that country, 85% of which is controlled by just 4 companies: Cargill, Tyson, JBS and the National Beef Packing Company. Now, you will no doubt have spotted the 45 days statistic in that USDOA definition. Those big 4 processing companies will point out that for the rest of the short life of these animals, they're roaming free, happily grazing on grass and pasture, just like nature intended. But providing enough space for 1.5 billion cows to wander around often comes at the cost of clearing large swathes of forestry land, most notably in rainforests like the Amazon. I mentioned right at the start of the video that food is responsible for 26% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. That's the best part of 14 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent every year. If we zoom into the food section of the bar chart, we can see that land use changes, including deforestation, make up just under a quarter of the overall emissions from the sector, accounting for something like 3.3 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent. There are those who put forward the argument that the only solution to these challenges is to rapidly move away from eating red meat like beef and lamb, so that the enormous amount of land currently being used for livestock grazing and cereal crops can either be reforested in areas like South America, Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, or in other areas just left alone to allow nature to get on with the process of so-called rewilding. There are lots of definitions for rewilding depending on which organisation you speak to, but they all essentially involve the restoration of ecosystem functions and biodiversity by reintroducing keystone species and apex predators and allowing natural processes to re-establish themselves. Why apex predators? Well, because nature doesn't tinker in the way that we humans do. It simply imposes the basic evolutionary principles that have resulted in all life on Earth. And that means large regions left to rewild don't just grow lots of shrubs and plants and become lush green wildernesses, sucking billions of tons of carbon dioxide up from the atmosphere. They also tend to attract natural herbivores who will happily eat all that green stuff and very effectively recirculate the CO2 back up into the air. That problem obviously differs in magnitude from country to country, depending on the indigenous wildlife that can be found there. This paper, published in the science journal Nature, calculated the greenhouse gas emissions per unit area from 2 adjacent regions in northern Tanzania. One was a 25,000 square kilometre wilderness area in the Serengeti Mara ecosystem, dominated by migratory wildebeest and elephants. The other was the Loliondo game controlled area right next door, which was used as grazing land for the livestock of the local Maasai pastoralists. The research data showed that emissions from the wilderness area measured 76.2 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per square kilometre compared to 76.5 tonnes per square kilometre from the managed pastoral land. In other words, exactly the same. That's not to say rewilding can't work in the right circumstances. Here in the UK, for example, the 3,500 acre Knepp farm in West Sussex was losing more than £1 million every year in the early 2000s as a result of decades of bad farming practices that have resulted in poor soil and low yields. So its owners abandoned their traditional livestock farming practices, sold off all their equipment and set about rewilding their land. 20 years on, and the Knepp estate is now a thriving wildlife haven, made financially viable through the diversification of income via ecotourism, safaris and organic meat production. The estate is now visited by thousands of people every year, and its success story is documented in a book called Wilding, which has now been made into an inspirational new film of the same name. And I've left a link in the description to that film's official trailer. The second buzz phrase echoing around the countrysides of the world right now is regenerative agriculture. It's a movement that appears to be causing a great deal of controversy and debate, especially in the farming community, with some folks remaining extremely sceptical of its claims, while others enthusiastically embrace the new techniques, presenting them as the future of land management and the fastest way to fix the climate emergency. There are 5 key principles at play here. Firstly, there's minimal soil disturbance, either from tillage or from adding chemicals. That keeps carbon in the ground and allows essential microorganisms to flourish. Secondly, the soil is kept covered when a cash crop isn't being grown. The old technique of keeping land fallow is now widely regarded as a damaging starvation diet for the soil and the vast network of biodiversity that lives in it. Regenerative land managers put a cover crop in during fallow periods to maintain a root system all year round and keep the soil active and healthy. Thirdly, by maximising crop diversity, farmers can naturally reduce the incidence of pests and disease and improve nutrient cycling, which supports greater biodiversity and improves the overall health of the soil without pesticides. A fourth principle is to integrate trees and shrubs into agricultural landscapes to provide habitats for wildlife, reduce soil erosion and enhance natural water cycles. The fifth principle is perhaps the most contentious, which is to integrate livestock in an intensively managed way by actively and regularly rotating the animals from one area of land to another. That allows them to graze the grass, trample the ground, break up the surface and distribute their naturally fertilising waste products before being moved on to the next zone. Proponents of this system claim it mimics nature's symbiotic relationship between herbivores and grasslands. In practice, herds often need to be rotated several times a day, so it's extremely labour intensive, but the land managers say there are tangible environmental and economic benefits to the system. Regenerative agriculture does now appear to have become a bit of a metaphorical get-out-of-jail-free card though, and there are suggestions that the terminology has been misappropriated by traditional farmers and ranchers, especially over there in the United States, who allegedly make no significant changes to their land management operations and simply use the regenerative term to get themselves onto the eco bandwagon and boost sales. That does raise the spectre of the vilification of farmers themselves though, many of whom are finding it increasingly difficult to make a living producing the food that you and I take for granted. The rapidly changing climate is certainly not helping. In the US and Europe, frozen ground in the winter is now often followed by months of torrential rain and then droughts and heat waves during the summer months, all of which severely impact the ability to plant and harvest anything commercially viable. According to this 2024 analysis by McKinsey, 90% of US farmers are fully aware of sustainable farming practices, but adoption rates remain low, largely because the financial support network simply isn't good enough to help them through the transition. This new study by researchers in Germany found that rising temperatures due to climate change could cause food prices to rise by more than 3% a year by 2035, compared to only 1.2% for overall inflation. In other words, an increasingly larger proportion of household income will have to be spent on food, and nowhere will that be more severely felt than in the global south. This map from Our World in Data shows the number of calories available on average per person by country in 2021. While you folks over in the States have almost 4,000 calories each, there are vast swathes of the global south that barely meet the requirements set out by the UNFAO. And even in countries that do just about meet that criterion, regional distribution varies massively as well. UN figures suggest that there are still around 800 million undernourished people around the world, and 2 billion people eating diets that are deficient in essential nutrients. A growing body of scientific researchers and environmental activists are now suggesting that a rapid phase-out of animal agriculture and a move to more plant-based diets would level up the playing field and allow much more equitable distribution of calories, protein and other nutrients to a far greater proportion of the global population, while at the same time radically reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The authors of this 2022 research paper calculated that persistent drops in atmospheric methane and nitrous oxide levels and slower carbon dioxide accumulation following a phase-out of livestock production would, through the end of this century, have the same cumulative effect on the warming potential of the atmosphere as a 25 gigaton per year reduction in anthropogenic CO2 emissions, providing half of the net emission reductions necessary to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Trouble is, convincing the majority of meat-eating Westerners to quit the food they love and start eating stuff they don't love so much will arguably be more difficult than passing the proverbial camel through the eye of the needle. And as citizens in the developing world are increasingly pulled out of abject poverty, one of the main status symbols of that improved prosperity is an increase in the amount of meat in their diet. But our scientists are telling us that if we ignore the warning signs, refuse to change our ways at all and continue to consume the way we do today, then a perfect storm of population growth, climate change and soil degradation will result in the failure of our current global food production system before a child born today reaches their retirement. According to the World Bank, roughly 1 billion people work in agriculture around the world, all of whom have families and livelihoods to protect. To achieve real change, those folks will need to make a radical transition in the coming years from food farmers to land and soil health managers. What can you and I do to help? Well, I'm sure it'll come as no surprise to you at all that the two biggest impacts we have are the amount of red meat we consume and the amount of food we waste. Not my place to lecture you about all that though, you're all intelligent people, so just have a look at the stats on the screen here and have a think about what you can do differently. Now, of course, no discussion about our future global food system would be complete without at least a passing mention of the precision fermentation and cellular agriculture technologies that we looked at in this video back in 2021. You and I know them better as lab-grown meat. Just the mention of that phrase seems to send many folks reaching for the sick bag, but trust me, it's on the horizon and it's approaching fast. There are dozens of developers in this sector all over the world, and China has even included alternative proteins in its 5-year agricultural development plan. By 2025, the goal is to reduce reliance on foreign technology and build what they call a low-carbon, sustainable, smart and integrated agricultural system. So is China's lab-grown food policy quietly stealing a march on the sleepy, complacent Western world in exactly the same way that that country's already done with its electric vehicle industry and its vast economic development projects across Asia and Africa? It's definitely something to think about, isn't it? I'll save that one for a future programme. Now, I've got a sneaky suspicion that there might just be some strong opinions on this particular subject, and I'm quite sure there'll be elements of the discussion that I've failed to include in this video. I didn't mention water consumption, for example. So if you've got additional information, or you're just feeling the urge to vent your spleen on the matter, then as always, the place to leave your thoughts is in the description section below. That's it for this week though. Thanks as always to our fantastic Patreon supporters who keep all these videos independent and completely free of ads and sponsorship messages. If you find the content useful and informative, and you feel like you could support my weekly work here on the channel, then why not pop over to patreon.com/justhavathink to have a look at the exclusive benefits you can enjoy there. And of course, you can hugely support us right here on YouTube, absolutely for free, by subscribing and hitting that like button. Won't cost you a penny to do that. It's just a simple mouse click away, either down there somewhere or on that icon there. As always, thanks very much for watching. Have a great week, and remember to just have a think. See you next week.